Chapter 10, If You Hum a Few Bars. Among the orderly rows of trees surrounding Sweet Apple Acres, Darren Grandel sat on a stump waiting for Applejack's next question. He supposed he should have expected some form of interview, he was applying for a job after all. But it still caught him a little off guard. Not that he expected to get the job automatically, it had simply been so long since he last applied for one that the process had been all but forgotten. The last time Darren had formally applied for work had been when he signed up for the military, and that had been nearly 1200 years ago. Darren was actually rather impressed at Applejack's level of detail. She had started with basic questions about his previous experience with this type of work. However, she had gradually begun to make more and more detailed inquiries, that he swiftly realized were designed to tell her his exact level of expertise on the topic of farming. She asked about ideal harvest times, how to tell what a crop's yield is likely to be, what soil was best for what kinds of crop, and so on. Finally, after almost an hour, Applejack seemed to have everything she needed. "Welp, I gotta say I'm impressed, y'all really know your stuff, so why don't I introduce you to Granny Smith, she's the one who'll make the final decision," Applejack stated, brushing herself off as she stood up. Darren nodded. "As you wish, Lady Applejack," Darren said as he rose, falling in step behind the orange mare. Apple Bloom, who had remained quiet throughout the questioning, walked alongside Darren with a smile on her face. "Don't worry, Mr. Grandel, I'm sure you're gonna get the job," she stated confidently, then lowering her voice she continued. "Ma sis ain't gonna admit it, but she was really impressed, she's got a good poker face but I can always see past it." Apple Bloom explained in a conspiratorial whisper. "I heard that, Apple Bloom. Y'all should show more respect for your big sis," Applejack called over her shoulder in a tone of mock anger. Apple Bloom just smirked, as Darren gave a soft chuckle at the light-hearted sibling banter. After a brief journey, the trio emerged from the rows of apple trees to behold their destination. A huge red barn that seemed to have been combined with a house loomed massively before them, and Darren wondered how the trees had managed to hide the titanic structure from view. Beyond it on a hill was a smaller but equally tall structure that was either a second residence, or an oversized cider house. As they got closer, a large stallion with a red coat, and orange-colored mane, came through what Darren guessed to be the door to the barn's living area. Noticing the large cross-section of an apple on his flank, Darren assumed this to be another member of the apple family. Applejack immediately made the introductions. "Hey there, Big Mac, I want y'all to meet our new farmhand Darren Grandel." "Darren, this is Apple Bloom's and my older brother Big Macintosh," Applejack said, confirming Darren's suspicions, and telling him that apparently Applejack also felt that he was sure to be hired. "A pleasure to make your acquaintance, Big Macintosh," Darren said with a smile as he extended his hand in greeting. Big Mac gripped the proffered hand in his hoof while wearing an especially welcoming expression. "Pleasure's all mine, Mr. Grandel, y'all saved my life during the dragon attack, so you've already made a good impression on me. Welcome to Sweet Apple Acres, we're honored to have you working with us," he said without even a trace of hesitation. "I assure you the honor is mine, your family has an exemplary farm here, it is a privilege to be invited to work on it," Darren said with a slight bow, his tone heartfelt. "Well, thank you, that's mighty kind of ya. I'd love to stay and chat, but I'm already behind on my chores, so I gotta skedaddle," Big Mac said regretfully. Darren nodded sympathetically. "I understand completely, please don't let me keep you," he replied. Big Mac nodded. "Yup," he said as he proceeded toward the fields. Darren smiled at the departing stallion before turning to see Apple Bloom, and Applejack staring at him with open mouths. "Miladies, is something wrong?" Darren asked in concern. "Y'all musta made one heck of an impression on Big Mac, he never talks that much to any pony, not even us," Apple Bloom said incredulously. Twilight Sparkle stood staring off into space at the train station, Rarity at her side. They had come to greet her assistant/adopted child Spike, and her apprentice/housemate Starlight Glimmer. Primarily they came simply to welcome them home, but partly it was to prepare them for their inevitable meeting with Darren. After Rarity and Applejack's rather intense first meeting with him, Twilight decided it would be best for Everpony if introductions were not quite so blunt. Honestly though, Twilight kept finding herself lost in her thoughts. Her mind constantly wandering to the subject of Darren. And not her normal thoughts like, what the weather had been like on his home planet, or what the dominant Nurian system of government was. Rather she kept dwelling on things like what kind of man style he might find attractive on a mare, or what humans did on dinner dates. She was so lost in thought that she didn't notice Rarity looking at her with a knowing expression. "So darling. Who's the lucky stallion?" she asked nonchalantly, a wide smirk plastered on her face. Twilight's thoughts came to a screeching halt on hearing Rarity's question. "I have no idea what you," Twilight started to say, only to find herself cut off by Rarity's upraised hoof. "Oh please darling, don't even try to deny it, it's written all over your face," Rarity said with a roll of her eyes. Twilight's cheeks burned as she tried to come up with a plausible way to refute her friend's words. However, Rarity continued before she could finish marshalling her thoughts. "You know, if I had to guess," Rarity drawled with a slightly evil-looking smile, "I would put my money on some pony new to Ponyville. A certain, knight in shining armor type, who recently rescued a certain princess. Has a passion for scholarly pursuits, extremely well-spoken, hard-working, knows how to cook. Handsome?" Rarity said with an ever-widening smirk as Twilight's face grew redder and redder. "Okay," Twilight shouted, startling several other nearby ponies, whose irate glares only made her face blaze even brighter. "You've made your point," Twilight grumbled. "Oh, and what point would that be, darling?" Rarity asked with a false innocence, determined to draw the truth out of her friend. Twilight grumbled something inaudible in response as she avoided Rarity's gaze. "Sorry dear, didn't quite catch that," Rarity said sweetly, a superior smirk creeping onto her features. Twilight mumbled a little bit louder, but still well below the threshold of understandable speech while staring pointedly at the ground. "A bit louder than that, darling," Rarity said, the smirk never leaving her face. "Okay fine, I have a crush on Darren, are you happy?" Twilight shouted, drawing another round of glares. Rarity smiled, and nodded. "Quite? So, have you told him?" she asked, examining a perfectly manicured hoof. "No." Twilight deadpanned. "Well, I'd hurry up if I were you, darling, you have a lot of competition if the local gossip is any indication," Rarity stated calmly, continuing to look at her hoof. Twilight shook her head. "Rarity, it's not that simple. He used to be married, he even had a daughter. It may have been a long time ago, but I can tell he hasn't forgotten. I don't want him to think I'm trying to take the place of his wife and child, or worse, trying to make him forget them," she explained angrily. Rarity instantly stopped looking at her manicure to give her friend an apologetic look. "Oh goodness darling, I'm so sorry, I didn't realize," Rarity said, suddenly feeling extremely guilty. Twilight nodded. "It's okay, just promise you won't tell any pony. Darren told me about his family in private conversation, and I don't want any pony to know unless I'm sure he's okay with it," Twilight said sadly. "My lips are sealed, darling," Rarity promised, placing a reassuring hoof on her friend's shoulder as a loud whistle heralded the Canterlot train coming into the station. Soon the platform was engulfed in steam, temporarily obscuring the train from sight amid the screech of steel grinding against steel. A moment later the air cleared and a conductor hopped out of the first car, loudly declaring that this was the Green Line from Canterlot arriving in Ponyville. The pronouncement was followed a moment later, the train car doors flying open to reveal the crowds of ponies within. By good fortune Starlight and Spike were some of the first passengers to disembark, and instantly spotted their friends waiting for them. "Twilight!" Starlight called out on seeing her mentor and rushing over, before adding a hurried but sincere, "Hey Rarity!" "Rarity!" Spike called out enthusiastically on sighting his crush, then adding almost as an afterthought, "Oh hey Twilight, how's it going?" Twilight and Rarity smiled, and rolled their eyes good-naturedly before responding, "I'm glad to see you both, How was Canterlot? Twilight asked. Spike shrugged noncommittally. It was alright. So Rarity, did ya miss me? He asked in what he no doubt thought was a suave tone of voice. Rarity, as always, seemed not to notice Spike's come on as she replied. Oh, of course I missed you, Spiky Wicky, we all did. She replied, tousling his head spines affectionately. Spike sighed as he chalked up another 0 on the romance meter. So Starlight, how was the conference on esoteric magic? Twilight asked with a smile. Starlight rolled her eyes in irritation. Honestly, it was a complete bust. I already knew most of the spells they discussed, and the ones I didn't were either boring or useless. For example, one unicorn was obsessed with a spell that would turn your main polka dot, but only when cast on a Wednesday, after drinking a cup of Darjeeling tea, and reciting the word wallaby backward 6 times. He just wouldn't stop droning on about it. It was crazy, she declared, sounding exhausted by the memory alone. Twilight giggled slightly at her apprentice's story before replying. Funny you should mention crazy things, 'cause we've had quite a bit of that around town lately, she said with a mysterious smile. Starlight gave Twilight a curious look. Oh, why, is Discord visiting or something? She joked. Twilight and Rarity exchanged knowing glances. Oh no, darling, this is a far more exotic type of crazy, and far less disruptive, Rarity said with a giggle. Starlight arched an eyebrow. Do tell. She replied a bit suspiciously. Twilight smiled. Alright, let's get your bags, and we'll tell you all about it. Darren stood at perfect attention as the elderly green-coated mare looked him over from head to toe. She scrutinized him closely as if searching for something no pony else could see. Welp, y'all certainly look like you can handle the farm life, and Applejack says you know plenty about the trade. Here she jumped up to balance on a chair on the tips of her back hooves, looking him in the eye like a drill instructor. But, she shouted with 4 hooves on her hips, and making every pony except Darren jump. Ultimately it's up to me to decide whether y'all got what it takes to work on this here farm, we clear young'un. Darren nodded. Ma'am, yes ma'am. Darren responded smartly, not moving an inch. Granny Smith nodded slowly. Will, seems like y'all know who's in charge right well enough, she said, stroking her chin with a wrinkled hoof. Darren gave a curt nod. Ma'am, yes ma'am. He intoned again. Granny nodded. All right, at ease then young'un, she commanded. Darren fell automatically into a perfect, at ease, position, eyes straight ahead, feet together, and hands clasped behind his back. Granny Smith nodded sharply before turning to face a slightly tense-looking Apple Bloom, and Applejack with a warm smile. I don't suppose y'all happen to find a few more like this lying around where he was? Applejack gave an audible sigh of relief, as Apple Bloom whooped. Does that mean? Apple Bloom asked, a wide smile appearing on her face. Granny Smith nodded. He's hired. Welcome to the sweet Apple Acres family, Mr. Grandel. I got a feeling you what this old place needs to get it going full steam ahead, she exclaimed, slapping the still at ease Darren on the leg before crying out in pain and rubbing her now sore hoof. Ma'am, yes ma'am, I will give a full 110%, ma'am, Darren declared in a clipped tone like he was on a military parade ground. Apple Bloom giggled at Darren's martial attitude, and Applejack had to turn away to hide her own chuckles. Granny Smith just gave Darren a slightly confused look. Huh, didn't reckon you could give more'n 100% of anything, but if'n ye say so, she said, scratching her head. By the way, why are y'all standin' like that? This here ain't the army, you know, she said as if just noticing Darren's stance. Oh, yes of course, forgive me venerable, old habits and such. Darren replied, slightly confused, but deciding not to bother commenting on it as he fully relaxed his stance. Suddenly Granny Smith glared at Darren. Who are you calling a vegetable young'un? She demanded. Darren was nonplussed for an instant before the coin dropped. What? Oh no, I said venerable, it's a term meaning respected elder. Apologies, I must not have spoken clearly. He explained. Oh. Granny Smith replied, looking slightly embarrassed. Well then, thank you kindly, Mr. Grandel. I'll let Applejack show you where you're gonna be workin'. Y'all have a good day now. You as well, venerable. My humble thanks for your time, and for granting me this opportunity. May the Seraphim keep you. Darren responded in a formal tone coupled with a deep bow. The who'll keep me where now? Granny Smith asked, scratching her head in confusion, as Apple Bloom and Applejack burst out laughing. And that's the whole story. Twilight finished. Starlight Glimmer and Spike sat in the middle of the castle library, staring open-mouthed at Twilight and Rarity for several seconds before speaking. So, what exactly is he doing here? Starlight asked, suspicion in her voice as her eyes narrowed slightly. Honestly, I think coming here may have just been an accident. He hasn't really been too clear on that. Twilight replied with a shrug. He kills DD dragons? Spike stuttered in terror as he visibly shuddered. Oh, don't worry, Spiky Wicky, he only hurts evil dragons, like that beast Garble. I am 100% certain you'll be good friends in no time, Rarity stated with a smile. Spike felt a little better from his crush's reassurance, but privately resolved to stay close to Twilight. So if this Darren guy is from another reality, why does he take orders from you? Starlight asked, giving Twilight a searching look. Twilight shrugged. I don't know, but when we first met he called me a Seraphim. I thought it was his people's word for alicorn at first, but I think there might be more to it than that. She replied. Are you sure he's even telling the truth? I mean, for all we know he could be Queen Chrysalis in disguise plotting some elaborate revenge, Starlight exclaimed, recalling the changeling queen with a shudder. Twilight gave her apprentice an irritated look. Okay, first off, if that were true he would have just let Garble roast me. Second, have you forgotten the warding spell I put up? If Darren was a changeling he would have reverted to his true form the instant he set hoof in Ponyville. You don't even know if that spell works, Twilight, it's never been tested on a real changeling. Starlight countered, a little surprised by how defensive Twilight sounded. I guess you have a point about him saving you, but aside from an extremely flimsy theory involving an ancient diary, that any pony might have found in the last 1,000 years, you still have almost no proof he's telling the truth. I know he is, Twilight said, her tone slightly harsher than she meant it to be. Starlight gave her teacher an annoyed look. How could you possibly know that? She demanded. Twilight began before realizing she was all but shouting. I just know Starlight, Twilight stated after taking a moment to calm down. Starlight was about to say that was not reassuring in the least. When Rarity decided to intervene. Starlight darling, with all due respect, you've never met Darren. He scared me half to death the first time I saw him, but I trust him. Just give him a chance, dear, and I think you'll see why we're so certain of him. She suggested placatingly. Starlight gave an exasperated sigh. Alright, fine, but I'm still gonna keep my eye out for anything suspicious, she said pointedly. Rarity nodded happily. I'm sure you'll see soon enough that you have absolutely no need to worry. The fashionista unicorn declared with a smile. So, when do we get to meet him? Starlight asked in a slightly strained voice. Right now, Twilight declared, swiftly rising to her hooves from her cushion. I got a message from him just before we picked you up at the train station. He's at Sweet Apple Acres interviewing for a job. Or poisoning the town. Starlight muttered under her breath. Twilight gave her apprentice a dirty look. He's probably done with the interview by now, so we'll head out to meet him. When we get there I expect Everpony to be polite to our guest, Twilight stated bitingly, before spinning on her hoof and walking out the door. What's with her? Spike asked, surprised at Twilight's behavior. Rarity considered explaining that Everpony gets a little testy when ponies disparage their crush, but instead settled on saying simply. Who knows? with a slightly nervous smile. Applejack stared in amazement at the dozens of full apple baskets in front of her. In less than an hour Darren had filled over a fourth of their quota for that day, and he was still going strong. Darting from apple tree to apple tree in a blur of movement, Darren seemed as swift on his hooves, or feet as humans called them, as Rainbow Dash was on her wings. Reaching a tree, he struck it smartly with his fist, then was gone before the fruit had even fallen halfway to the baskets beneath. After performing the process about 50 times, he shot back to the first tree, and without pausing he grabbed 2 large baskets of apples under his arms. Not stopping for an instant, he placed them in a nearby cart before returning for more. Once the cart was full, Darren grabbed hold of the shafts, and all but sprinted down the hill to unload everything, somehow managing the whole process without bruising or losing a single apple. Soon the only trouble was that Applejack, Big Mac, and Apple Bloom just couldn't keep pace. Darren seemed immune to exhaustion, and approached his work with the same furious spirit with which he fought his enemies. "All right Darren, I think y'all can stop for a spell," Applejack said, trying not to sound like she was begging, as her brother and sister collapsed nearby. Darren gave Applejack a confused look. "Are you certain, Lady Applejack? It hasn't even been an hour, and we've not even filled half the amount you specified," he said in mild confusion. "What in Equestria does this fella run on? He's like a machine?" Applejack wondered as she answered. No, and believe me, y'all are doing an amazing job, but this pace really takes it out of ya," she explained with a smile slightly strained by exhaustion. Instantly Darren felt guilty. He had been so concerned with putting his best foot forward he had forgotten to consider that not every pony had his immunity to fatigue. "Forgive me my friends, I did not mean to be quite so intense in my efforts," Darren offered apologetically. Applejack smiled. Darren really was a sweet guy, despite his talent for violence. "Hey, don't apologize, fair workin' hard, you maybe ease up a mite," she suggested with a smile. Darren nodded. "Of course m'lady, is there anything I can do for you while we rest?" he asked. Applejack laughed. "Y'all really don't get the idea behind restin', do ya?" she asked with a wide smile. Darren shrugged. "I will rest when I am no longer needed, not before," he replied with a good-natured grin. Applejack kept smiling as she shook her head. "Y'all know any good workin' songs?" she half joked. Darren thought for a moment before slowly nodding. "Actually, I just might," he answered. Applejack shot Darren a surprised look. "Really?" she asked curiously. She hadn't pegged Darren as the singing type. Darren nodded. "I know a few old marching songs from my days as a soldier," he explained. "Shall I sing one?" Ooh, I wanna hear one," Apple Bloom cried out, as curiosity and excitement overrode her feelings of exhaustion. Darren glanced at Applejack, who gave him a nod. "Very well, this song is known as," Darren began before finding himself interrupted. "Darren!" called a familiar voice that Darren swiftly traced to a furiously waving figure down the orchard's main path. Darren returned the wave, motioning for Twilight, and the small group with her to come closer. "Lady Twilight, Lady Rarity, a pleasure to see you again," Darren said with a polite bow. "Howdy Twee, hey Rarity, Spike, Starlight," Applejack said, rising to greet her friend. "Nice ta see y'all," Apple Bloom added. "Yup," Big Mac offered after finally getting his breath back. Darren glanced toward Starlight, and Spike. "Forgive me, I don't believe I've had the pleasure," he said with a warm smile. Starlight and Spike were momentarily tongue-tied. Twilight and Rarity had told them what to expect, but they doubted anything could have truly prepared them for this. Darren seemed to tower over them both, and his armor made him seem larger and more intimidating still. Fortunately, Twilight had expected their reaction, and made the introductions. "Darren Grandel, I'd like you to meet my student, Starlight Glimmer, and my #1 assistant, Spike the Dragon." Darren nodded, extending his hand. "An honor to meet you both," he said formally. Starlight cautiously gripped Darren's hand, in her hoof, and allowed him to shake it, finding his grip firm, but not uncomfortable. "Nice to meet you," Starlight said slowly, carefully examining Darren's face for the slightest sign of dishonesty, and feeling mildly frustrated when she couldn't find any. Releasing Starlight's hoof, Darren turned to Spike, who was trembling like a leaf. The Doomslayer seemed a lot scarier that Twilight had described. "And then nice to meet you, Mr. Grendel SS sir," Spike said, extending a trembling claw. Gently gripping the proffered limb, Darren gave a reassuring smile. "Be at ease, young Drake, you are a child of the Seraphim, and as such, need never fear me," he said, inclining his head in a small bow. Spike nodded, still uneasy, but somewhat reassured. "I got your message from Lily earlier, I hope we didn't interrupt anything," Twilight commented apologetically. Darren shook his head. "Not at all, m'lady, we were just taking a short rest." "Mr. Darren was gonna sing us a song," Apple Bloom stated enthusiastically. "Oh? I didn't know you could sing, Darren," Twilight said, giving her friend a fascinated look. Darren gave a self-depreciating smile. "In all honesty, m'lady, I've only ever done it a few times, and there are far finer voices than mine. However, I can carry a tune reasonably well, or at least, well enough that my audience can sit through to the end," he stated with a slight chuckle. Twilight giggled as she replied. "Would you mind if we listened in? I would really like to hear you sing." Darren nodded. "If Lady Applejack has no objections. She isn't paying me to sing after all," he stated with a glance at his employer. Applejack shook her head. "Shoot no, I wanna hear this too, 'sides I'm still a mite tuckered from racin' after y'all," she said with a laugh. Smiling, Darren inclined his head before heading to a small hillock where he could more easily ensure his audience would hear him. "All right, now as I was explaining, this is an old marching song from when I was a soldier called the Guardian's Prayer. I must ask for your patience as it has been some time since I last sung it and I may be a bit rusty." His audience watched in rapt attention as Darren took a deep breath, and began his song. One of the amazing things about Equestria, and one of its greatest mysteries, was the truly remarkable properties it had when it came to song. It was as if reality itself could alter to accompany the words and emotions of any who would raise their voice in glorious expression of the rhythmic arts. Ponies who had never sung in their lives, could somehow find the tune and lyrics to express themselves. What's more, even the poorest quality voice could somehow sound beautiful as long as the emotions behind it were true. But perhaps the most enchanting aspect of this property, was that even in the absence of any instruments, music could still somehow be heard. While so ephemeral it could almost be dismissed as a fantasy, the sound was nonetheless there. When Darren began by humming the appropriate tune, his listeners heard it as a phantom organ, that soon transitioned into the music proper. Then Darren began the actual song, and all present were held enraptured. As Darren's voice echoed throughout the orchard, his listeners closed their eyes, letting the lyrics wash over them. As they did, they could almost see them. Thousands of human warriors clad in great suits of armor marching forth with Darren at their head. Unflinching, undoubting, and unafraid they walked forward bearing the banner of Equestria. In their mind's eye, Darren's audience saw a great and terrible darkness on the horizon. Creatures of pure evil that, while hazy and indistinct, were nonetheless far more terrifying than any villain that Twilight and her friends had ever faced. These imagined foes seemed to taint the very air with their presence, and yet the humans were unmoved. Standing before this vile tide of impurity, they set shields, readied weapons, and braced for battle. Behind them the listeners could see Equestria, beautiful and peaceful, yet helpless before the darkness that surged toward the wall of warriors. If the line broke, Equestria would surely die. But the line would not break, not now, not ever. The song seemed almost to proclaim it as law, that though these men might die, that which they fought for would survive, no matter what. The song continued, and the apples felt their exhaustion vanish, replaced by a fierce determination and pride that filled their weary bodies with new strength. Meanwhile, Rarity and Twilight felt their eyes grow damp at the bravery of the warriors the song described. In their heads they saw the two sides of the vividly imagined conflict clash in a titanic struggle between light and dark. Each listener imagined something slightly different, but all were moved by the images the song conjured. See the light in our eyes, doomed slayers are marching on. With our weapons in hand for the kingdom and holy land. See the light in our eyes, doomed slayers are marching on. See the light in our eyes, doomed slayers are marching on. Modrar vora som I himlen helgade diep nam. Et laga til dit rijkender den vilja. Som I himlen oxa pa Jordan, ge spurt I dag. Og forlat os vor skuld. As the last verse of the song faded into silence, the visions the song inspired slowly vanished and the ponies' minds returned to the present time. Applejack, Apple Bloom, and Big Macintosh, cheered and stomped their hooves in the pony version of applause. Twilight, Rarity, Spike, and Starlight simply stared at Darren in awe. Land sakes, Mr. Grandel, that was amazing. Y'all have an incredible voice, heck y'all oughta be a rock star with pipes like that, Applejack declared with complete sincerity. That song was awesome. Hearing it made me feel like I can do anything. Apple Bloom declared. Yup. Big Mac declared enthusiastically. Darren gave a humble bow. I am pleased you all enjoyed my singing. Honestly, I'm surprised I managed to recall the proper tune, to say nothing of the words. He replied with a slightly embarrassed smile. Darling, that was positively divine, your talent is truly too much for words to do justice, Rarity gushed. But what did that strange chant at the end mean? She asked after a brief pause. Darren smiled. Roughly translated, it means, Our mothers, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name, thy kingdom come, thy will be done, as it is in heaven on earth, give us today our daily bread and forgive us our guilt. He explained with a small smile. Rarity grinned appreciatively. Oh, how lovely, it sounds almost like a poem. She remarked, clapping her hooves together in delighted excitement. Darren gave a small chuckle. Something like that, he said with a faint smile. As Darren, and the others spoke, three figures remained silent. Starlight watched Darren's every move, and word like a hawk. While she respected Twilight, and her other friends immensely, she still felt they were being naive. Even if Darren had been gone for over 1,000 years, it seemed almost inconceivable that no records existed of him. He was wholly alien to not just Equestria, but the entire dimension it resided in. So why were there no legends, or myths, or stories about him, or at least something like him? Surely the scholars of the time would have wanted to record such a unique creature. Yet even Twilight, who had read almost every book ever printed on weird or mystical subjects, had never heard of him. Add to all that Darren claimed to know Celestia, and Luna, but no pony ever heard them mention him, and Starlight smelled a rat. As Starlight brooded on Darren's loyalties, Spike found himself watching intently as Darren spoke with Rarity. Frankly, seeing his crush chatting away so amicably with the human bugged him. It wasn't as if he'd never seen Rarity with a stallion before, but somehow this felt different. Darren just seemed so charming. He possessed a sort of unconscious appeal that Spike was at a loss to describe. Worst of all, Spike didn't think Darren was doing it on purpose. He was just one of those rare stallions who could endear himself to some pony simply by being himself. Rarity had had crushes, and even romantic obsessions before, but somehow Spike had always known they would never go anywhere. Like with Trenderhoof, Spike had somehow just known that he wasn't ever going to be interested in Rarity. Just like he somehow knew Prince Blueblood would disappoint her. But Darren? Spike could tell that all Darren would have to do is ask Rarity out one time, and he'd be hearing wedding bells inside a year. With Spike and Starlight absorbed in their respective thoughts, Twilight found herself enraptured in a conundrum of her own. As Rarity, and the apple spoke with Darren, she proceeded to analyze the song she had just heard. Something about the lyrics bothered her. At first she thought it might be the fact that the lyrics strongly implied that Seraphim meant something along the lines of, goddess. That in and of itself warranted a conversation with Darren about the term's meaning, but it wasn't what was bothering her. Going through the lines of the song, Twilight had greater occasion than usual to bless her photographic memory. In the name of light our enemies chastise? No, that's pretty cut, and dry. Twilight thought, placing a hoof on her chin. Into battle facing the fire, Seraph, thy will be done? No, that's not it. What is it? Something about this song feels off, but what could it? And suddenly, it all clicked. It was the chorus that was bothering her. Doom slayers were marching on, slayers plural. Twilight's eyes widened as she stared in shock at Darren. It was an idea so crazy she could hardly credit it, but could there be more than one Doom slayer? Twilight whispered to herself.